Hey everybody, it's the Maple Syrup Show. We're live, and sorry about being a little late. Something about Facebook is a little bit messed up, so we will not be there today. I'll get that fixed. It's something to do with permissions. But hey, we've got lots of guests here today, and we are ready to go. So, welcome to Morgan and Chris. How are y'all doing?
Doing
Doing
great.
well
How are
this
you?
evening.
Yeah, wonderful. So, Kat, I'm gonna hand it
Hello.
over to you while I fix stuff.
Yeah, I was just trying to actually post a link to the YouTube in the Facebook event, and it won't let me comment in the event either. So I think it's Facebook being ridiculous. So
Yeah,
let's
it might
ignore all
be.
the technical stuff. What we would like to do now is ask your origin stories. So I think what we're going to do is we'll start with you, Chris. So, Chris, if you could tell us a little bit about how you got into the game design world or just board games in general, what got you interested in that, how you sort of traveled through that little path, and where you are now.
Yeah, so I was in college. I actually went to school for film and television, but I always thought, man, how cool would it be to make games? But it's the early 2000s, so that idea was insane, right? And it's like, how cool would it be if I made my card game? I grew up with things like the Pokemon card game and Magic and Yu-Gi-Oh, and I just made this card game for fun. And then it was around 2012 when Kickstarter started becoming a thing, so I just kind of put my indie project for fun on Kickstarter, and it did well. And then it really opened up the world of board games as large to me, and I discovered hobby board games, and I just got sucked in and stayed there. And I eventually made it my career.
Okay, so you do this now full time. This is your thing.
It's full time, yeah.
Okay, cool. That's fantastic. And Morgan, what is your origin story?
Hi there. So I've been playing and making games for as long as I can remember. My father was big into the original D&D back when it released in the 70s. I started working with the local print shop at Staples to print my prototypes. I ended up getting a job there. I ended up managing that department and have just kind of jumped between print jobs from there, getting more and more design focused until now. Here I am running my own firm called Jovial Graphics.
And so now you do that like for realsies as well. That's awesome.
For realsies, indeed.
And we know each other because you're doing the graphic design for BubbleNet.
That's correct.
I've got the old prototype box on the shelf behind me there. So
yeah, it's been a fantastic project. I'm really proud of the work that we've done together.
Thank you. Yeah, it's going really well. We're learning a lot. We expected that we wouldn't know a lot of the things that you need to know to get a game printed. We know how to make a prototype, but we don't understand all of that other stuff that you learn. So we definitely wanted to make sure we were working with someone who knew those bits. Chris, how did you find that process when you were after your first successful Kickstarter? How did you find the process of actually getting your game printed?
So the answer is painfully at first. I was just kind of like, hey, let me Google search something. I discovered what the Gamma trade show was. And I went there as just like some guy, and I just asked a lot of questions. I met the company Panda, and they're the ones that published manufactured my first game. It just kind of went from there. There was a lot of like amateur hour stuff about the way my game's files were. Every card was a Photoshop file. It was completely insane, but they tolerated me. And then as I delivered the game, people would be like, hey, did you know you could do it this way? And I really like processes. So aside from the game itself, finding ways to like make it more effectively also makes me happy. So I just those two in parallel ended up leading from being just a hobby to eventually doing it for work.
When I discovered that I could data merge, I was very, very happy. That made me extremely. I was like, oh yes. Because I used to do mail merges and things like that for work and all those sorts of things. And I was like, why do I have to type this? Why? Or why do I have to write this on cards? So yes, it's like, processes, very exciting.
Yeah, absolutely.
Morgan, when you're thinking about the processes in graphic design, what are some of the things that you think that people who haven't actually published a game might not know are important? Because we think about, layout, but there's more to graphic design than layout, right?
Absolutely. So there are a couple of important things to think about in designing for board game. far as graphic design goes. The one that springs most readily to mind is that you are making a print product. And when you are making a print product, you have to think about print design specifically. It is going to need to be printed on a piece of paper and then cut out of that piece of paper. So you need to be thinking about bleeds, you need to be thinking about your color space, you need to be thinking about what material it's going to go on. All of those things are very important, and if you haven't kind of been in the trenches working with those pieces of paper and seeing how these materials work, it's sometimes pretty difficult to imagine what it's actually going to turn out with. And a lot of folks who are first-time designers who we've worked with, when they get that first prototype, often before they start working with us, are usually pretty surprised at how different it looks in paper versus on their screen. The other thing to think about is that as a game maker, you are designing a tool. You're designing a tool that humans use to deliver fun to themselves. So thinking about how to most effectively communicate how to use that tool is just a good thing to keep in mind when you're thinking about the graphics for your game. And I can certainly get into more detail about specifics of that later, but that's kind of the overarching things. That remember that you're making a tool.
What do you think about that, Chris? The making a tool. Do you see the game that you're designing in that way?
Actually, before I answer that question, I want to talk about like you were saying how it looks different on your screen and on the card, and that difference is so massive that sometimes even now I'll look at my print version and be like, I should probably scale back the detailing on the card in some way, or maybe that card frame is over textured, because the simpler it is, it's going to look great on the card, but it might look too simple on my screen and vice versa, So
that's a really good point. Before I did games, I did fabric design. And I still do. I just sort of casually in the background, I just have Spoonflower running, and I have about 1,500 designs on there. So people buy them and stuff, and it's nice. But one of the things that I didn't really understand was how different those designs would look on the different fabrics. So I thought, oh, yes, this will work on cotton, and I bought it on cotton, and it was great. But then when people bought it on a different fabric, it just didn't actually read at all. And in others, it was too dark for that fabric type, and in others, it washed out completely. And so there was a lot of, oh, okay, I have to think about this not just in terms of that one thing, but in terms of all the places it gets used. And the way that I'm applying that now in terms of game design is I'm thinking, okay, if I have this one illustration, it works really well on the card backs. But if I try and use it on the box, there's not enough of it. It's great for a card back, but once it becomes a box design, that's, there's just, and those sorts of things. So thinking about the graphics from that perspective, like the actual graphics, so the images from that perspective is really interesting as someone who's primarily an illustrator in that context. But then there's the actual tool side of it, which I find really interesting. I thought that was a really interesting expression to use, because it's the access to the fun. And not all board games are fun, and board games don't have to be fun in order to be successful games. But in general, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to entertain ourselves. So,
yes.
Morgan, do you want to talk about that?
Entertainment and fun are different things.
Sorry, I talked at the same time as you. Do you want to talk about that idea a bit more, about the idea of it being sort of the way that you access that fun through graphic design?
Sure. Yeah, I'd be happy to talk about that. So graphic design as a discipline in general is about solving visual problems and visual communication. So if I am attempting to instruct you on a process, I can type out that process. I can say, first do this, then do that, then do that. I can also make a series of pictures that do that. So graphic design is essentially trying to figure out what pictures to show you in order to communicate the things that I'm trying to tell you.
That's a big Sen thing, show, don't tell.
Mm-hmm. And usually some combination of that is necessary for communicating the concept that you want to do, especially as your game gets more complex. Often you will need to have more information on a given area than you can accurately summarize in just text. So that's why we use things like colors and shapes and forms and textures and things like that to
help, symbols.
Yeah, to help create a shorthand or an alphabet for what it is that we're trying to say.
So one of the things I find is a major challenge for me in more complicated games is the ones that tend to use enormous numbers of symbols and icons and things on the card, because for me that makes it harder. Like yes, sure, if it was just a wall of text, I also would not be able to process that very well, but I find it particularly difficult when it's take one icon and then add icon, unless icon, and I'm just going, ah. So there's a line for me where I get to the point where I'm like, no. But I know that people, for example, who have a background in maybe Magic or games like that, where they're really accustomed to constantly processing all those symbols, are very comfortable with a card that's almost got no words on it and is just symbol, 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 symbol. And so
Magic is
knowing your
actually
audience is quite important there, I think.
Magic is actually a weird example because Magic actually uses very few icons.
Oh yeah,
and
I don't mean Magic.
mostly
What do I
expressed in
mean?
text.
There's a lot of games that are icon heavy, like Seven Wonders,
Yeah.
stuff like that, right?
Bang is
Roll,
also
roll
one
for the
that-
galaxy.
point too.
Yeah. I don't play Magic. I find Magic very confusing as well. So I'm very much a board gamer. Like my background is Euros. I'm very comfortable in Euros. I like tile laying games. I like puzzly games. I get quite distressed when it's very sort of well, not distressed, but when it's lots and lots of cascading effects and I don't have a chance to get my head around that, I get quite confused there. And so having the guidance through the design of the teach is really, really helpful to me. So another thing that I think Sen will probably agree with me about is the importance of the player guide, or that little assistance that you get.
Oh, like a player aid, yeah.
Player aid, that's what I'm trying to say. Because I know when Sen's designing a game, he doesn't write his rule book. He goes straight to the player guide, and that's sort of his guidance.
It's easier to make a player aid than it is to write a whole rule book. So
yes,
and the rules are going to change over the course of the development of the game, right? So
yes.
it's just I don't like wasting time. I like efficiency. So just like I like on my games, I just want to make something quick and dirty that we can change immediately. For example, last night we changed the cost of something and we just changed it on a player aid, and now everybody knows. If we had written that into the rules, we might have to change it in several different places, and we might miss it somewhere. So anyways, I just like that it's easier to update, and then you can totally discard things. You can change the icons and make sure that's done throughout your documentation faster. The less you have anyways, like it's minimalist. That's all. So I wanted to ask Chris,
Briefly,
go ahead.
May I come briefly back to the subject of
Sure.
iconography? I think this is a really interesting piece of
Yeah.
game graphic design in particular. So iconography is one of the most rewarding and challenging things that I can do as a graphic designer. And when you're building a set of icons, you should think about it like building an alphabet. In English, for instance, each letter of our alphabet corresponds to a sound, and then the combination of those sounds creates a word. The more symbols, and especially the more combinations of symbols that you have your player learn, the more difficult that alphabet is to comprehend, especially if certain letters in your alphabet, say like X or Q or something like that, if those are not used frequently, then it becomes difficult for the person who is learning that alphabet to attempt to understand what that alphabet is trying to say.
That's a really good way of putting it. That's exactly what happens to me.
In English, our alphabet is phonetic, so that means that you can sort of combine these things in general, learn a very small number of things to create a large number of concepts. If you've got just a ton of icons in your game and they all mean one thing and you don't use any text at all, it's like learning Chinese, right? Chinese has a million different words that are all summarized in one icon, and you have to memorize all of those things. So it becomes very difficult for someone who isn't familiar with your system to kind of get into. So for those of you out there who are looking at making your own game's iconography, start with text first and see if there's a very common concept that you find yourself wanting to summarize frequently, rather than jumping straight into making icons for everything. Because not every concept in your game needs to be an icon.
Yeah,
that's a very
I'm
good
gonna
point.
I'm gonna build on that. I was working on a game, and started, like you said, it's text. I think that these have words, but as the game developed, I realized that the discovery of the game is really high. It's a game where you draft cards. You're not seeing the same cards, and they're all so different. and we just cut the keywords out completely, only went with words, because the question was always, what is this icon? And the frequency of seeing it again was infrequent in that one session of play. But I didn't feel that until I was like, when I'm looking at my data sheet and I see a bunch of lines that used the same word, right? So how does it relate to the play experience? How often are you seeing that keyword or icon?
Correct.
That's a very good way of looking at it as well. I've been developing, I've just had a bunch of game ideas. I'm working on my 5th game in like 2 weeks, which is just, and one of those games has 3 common things, but each one of them applies to a different situation. And I had different icons for every single one of those. And I was like, actually, you know what? It's really actually a combo of these icons. So it's like icon, like category A plus play, or category A plus team, or category A plus other thing, not 700 million different versions. And so that's what I will work on when I cycle back round to that one. And that's, I think, exactly that sort of thing where it's just like, the words will make much more sense to me. I'm just going to go back to that.
It's letters in your alphabet, right? And those letters combine to make words.
So, Morgan, do you find that as a graphic designer, you're helping other designers figure that out, or do they usually come to you saying, "This needs an icon. Can you create one for me?"
So the specialty of my firm is in information design. Obviously, we do aesthetic things as well, but information design is where we really shine. Typically, with a new project, we take a look at all of the concepts in the game. I build a concept bank in a big spreadsheet for me to understand, like, what are the things that need to be represented in this game? How frequent are they? What is the context in which they're used? Like, is this something that's only in the rule book? Is this something that's on cards? Is this something on the board? Does it need to match up with other things? And then we'll use that to develop what representation we use to talk about that concept. Sometimes that's an icon, sometimes that's a keyword, sometimes that's just text on a card. It really depends. There's no one size fits all solution for how to represent things in any given game, because every game is so different. Every game's needs are very different.
And it's very tempting very early in the process to be like, oh, this should be an icon, and to just jump straight into doing that. And I think as a game designer, it's important to remember that this is a different game. And I often try and just let the game tell me what it wants. Do you ever get that, Chris, where you're sort of sitting there and you're trying to figure out what this game actually wants from you?
Yeah, I won't name any games in specific, but I was looking at one that was basically a formula they wanted me to do with icons, and I was like, I can't play this, because I can't look across the table and look at all these cards and then process what that question is asking me to find out what that card says. What I do want to do is look at the tableau and see, like, I see that red marine icon. That card must do with marine cards. Maybe I'll read it now. And it kind of like directed my attention. I think that icons are useful for that too.
That's a really good way of putting it.
Yeah, but when they're like I don't know. Like you said, it's different for each game. So I don't want to say do or don't these things, but when you do your play test, see how people are processing this information
and what they ask about.
Mm-hmm.
So, Chris, as somebody who's published games, do you think about language independence? Because that's where a lot of this iconography overload might come from, is when you're trying to be language free so that you can simply publish the game in many, many languages by changing the rule book or the player aid only, and not have to do massive amounts of translation and restructuring of your cards because you have to change all the text too.
So I haven't done that, mainly because some of my games do have localizations, but it's not a huge part of my business, so I can safely ignore it and make the card as readable as possible instead. I don't want to like design for the localization and then like make this game harder in English, the language I know, right? So I don't. It's not a variable for me. But I do want to simplify it as much as possible. I always ask myself, well, can I cut a word from this and have it mean the exact same thing? And you'll be surprised how small you can get text with the right combination of words and icons.
So you saying that. So my background is I'm a business analyst, which is a form of technical writing. And that's one of the things that I used to absolutely love doing with other people's text, because what we would do is we would peer review each other. So someone would try and simplify it, and I'd be like, okay, how much further can I get the word count down? And then I'd pass it back. And so we would cycle our documents back and forth, trying to get the word count even further down. We would like make our columns a particular size for our requirements documents and say we have to get the sentence in the column. Those sorts of things, to try and just get them as simple as possible, but still have exactly what we need in them. So yeah, that's a really good point. Oh, okay. So we've got a question from George here saying, so he's Mr. Twillith on YouTube. Oh, that's a great topic. Any tips for keeping information quickly parsable across the table? And a 90, 180, or what?
Yeah,
And
so when you're
So
sitting
if it's
on a
rotated,
corner or sitting across
yeah,
from somebody,
in front of other
and the
players.
cards aren't universally readable.
Okay. Briefly before I answer that, I have something to say about localization and some cool print design things that you can do to make that easier, but I'll get to that once we talk about the question. So text is not super easily readable at different angles, unless there is very little of it. So the way that we can associate information in graphic design is by putting it in containers and grouping it by form, color, so on and so forth. So Chris, you had an example of having a tableau of stuff in front of you and wanting to see what things related to particular things. Let's say I'm playing a game in which I've got things that I can pay stone for and then things that give me stone in my tableau. If I just look at my tableau and see a bunch of stone icons, that doesn't actually help me narrow down which things that I can do with stone, because it also shows me the things that I need to pay stone for. So in that situation, I might recommend having a couple of different containers. Maybe the left side is red with the cost and maybe the right side is green with the effect, such that you can use both of those pieces together to figure out, okay, if I'm looking for something to spend my stone on, I'm going to be looking for a stone icon in the green section. So I'm going to look at my green sections first and then try and find the stone inside that. So far as keeping things readable across the table and in different orientations, size obviously is a big one. Size is just something good to think about when you're thinking about people with visual issues. Readability is key when trying to design for accessibility, and accessibility includes looking at things across the table. Using those containers, like I just mentioned, to make sure that the information is always in a particular place allows you to easily flip that card in your head and say, like, oh, okay, this information is always on the left side of the card. If I see that it's flipped over 180 degrees and it's now on the right side of the card, I can just flip that back over in my head and see, yes, this is the cost of the card, for instance. It's always on the left.
So in terms
containers.
of accessibility, there's a lot of discussion about point size for fonts, so or for text. That's that little number, and 9 point, 7 point, those sorts of things. I've heard people talk about using that size on cards. Yes, if you're 20, that should be just fine. You should be able to read something. You're 20 and you don't wear glasses yet. You should be just fine. But I noticed as the 30s and 40s came on, I was like, this is actually a bit difficult. And then you get tired, and then you're playing at a pub or all those sorts of things, and the light's not as good. And suddenly you're going, can someone tell me what this card says? And now it's not a secret anymore. And so I was interested to see, does anyone have any personal minimum font sizes? For me, it's 11, unless it's a font that's already quite big. And that's an in your hand font. On the table, it's got to be bigger than that.
Maybe my font should be bigger. My cards definitely have the room for it. I just do 8, but it really depends on its relation to the other things on the card, right? Like, I have a game space line, and what you need to know is the cost of the card and the name, because those 7 cards they're playing gets rearranged. You cannot read the card across the table, but the game is only demanding that you remember 7 total things. So it's okay you don't remember, you can't read it across the table, but I need you to see the art. So that way it's kind of contained in the art form, right? If you needed to read the card with great effect or more cards, then maybe the font size would be different, or maybe even the cards might be simpler. I'm very willing to simplify my design to, make it more bandwidth friendly.
So,
They're
but these
actually-
cards, they're ones you'd have in the hand, right? The ones with the 8-point font.
Yeah, I mean, they're on the table too. I mean, I just
But
do
you
it.
don't need
I
to
haven't
do
really
it
thought
on the
through.
table.
I think 11's fine.
Yeah.
I think when you start getting into like 14, you're saying,
Oh, no,
the
that's
header's too much. Yeah.
that's
But,
slightly insulting.
Yeah.
I mean, it does help, but it is it's a bit insulting because
So there are actually some standards that we use to figure out readability of different elements. 8-point is the minimum acceptable font size typically for arm's length reading. So if you have something in your hand, that's arm's length reading. If you have something on the table, that's table length, and then things further out like signage and billboards, we're not really making signage and billboards in board games, so that doesn't really matter. But typically for arm's length reading, you want it at 8. At table length reading, you want it at least 10. 11 is preferable.
most of my cards end up on the table as well, and other people need to be able to see them. So I generally use that 11 as a guide. But
Yeah,
every now and then
you're
I'll
right.
go down. It depends on the font too. Like if it's Arial, Arial can work at something like 8 reasonably comfortably, even on the table for a lot of people. But if it's some of those other ones that are already really tiny, or they're quite narrow, or they've got like the kerning's the word I want, isn't it? The space between the letters.
Space between letters, yes.
If that's really tight, then I need them to be a bit bigger. Otherwise, they start to blend together.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that can be enhanced or diminished depending on things like contrast and lighting and the media it's actually on. Does it have texture? Does it not? Is it flat on the table? Is it raised?
That's a good other topic.
There's other factors, but yes, I think you're right, Morgan, that we have to be considerate about, can I use that tool, right? Like you're saying, they're tools to have fun, and if I can't use it because I can't read it, then is it fun anymore? And if I can't access the information, right?
That's a good point. I'm talking black on white.
Also true, right?
As soon as it's white on black, for example, it does need to be a little bit bigger for me.
Yeah,
or if
it's different.
Like yellow on anything, we have a problem.
So speaking of black and white, y'all were mentioning localization, and there's actually some fun print design stuff that you can use to make your localization a little easier if you are using text. So printing for board games is typically done with offset printing, and offset printing involves a set of plates that are applied to paper with different colors of ink on them. You've got cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. Each of these plates need to be cut individually, and these plates can be changed out if you are changing something on one color but not the others. So typically how localization works for text-heavy games is that only the black plate will be replaced, such that only the things that are on the black section, like text, are changed out. Each of these plates is expensive to produce. So if you can just change out one plate versus all of your plates, that can potentially save you quite a lot of money when you're then going to localize. So if you are planning on printing in other languages, you don't necessarily have to go 100% icons if that's not good for your game. You can still include text, just make sure that it's all black text.
Right.
And that's CMYK, by the way, for those who aren't aware of it.
Correct.
CMYK, when you see that, that's talking about the printing, which is cyan, magenta, yellow, and K, which means black.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I could talk forever about color profiles and different printing methods and things like that.
Yeah, we don't necessarily have to do that.
But we don't have to get that.
The one thing you should know, everybody out there, is don't work in RGB. That's the rule. Well, I mean, you can. It just won't look the same when you get it.
For digital, RGB is fine, but for print, even so, when you're looking at it on your screen, this is one of the things I find fascinating. And I bought a Pantone fan deck, which I can never find when I want to talk about it because I keep it out of the sun so it doesn't fade. But I bought a Pantone fan deck simply so that I could understand, because I used to sell house paint. And one of my jobs was explaining to people that, yes, this test pot looks wonderful here, but you should probably take it home, paint it out on a piece of paper and move it around the room at the orientation that it's going to be in your room, because it will look different. And they're like, oh, that's not true. And I'm like, cool, come with me. And so I take them with this piece of painted cardboard, and I walk around the room that we're in right now, and they're like, oh.
Yeah, it'll even look different relative to other colors, right? So the brain is an amazing thing.
Yeah.
Troy
raises
Cabin
a good
says,
part.
Yeah.
So if you have another printing process that's going over that, like if you're doing spot foil or spot gloss, or if you're doing a spot color, for instance, if you're printing on acrylic and you need to put white ink on there, white is not typically in like your regular 4-color process, so you'd have an extra pass on top of those 4 colors to do whatever it is that you're putting on there. So there's all kinds of fun things that you can do with extra printing passes to make your product look much more premium.
Yeah, and your manufacturers will talk to you about that if you get that to that stage, which is wonderful and great. For those of you who just make prototypes, you don't have to worry about it. For those of you who sign your games away to other people and they get to do that fun decision part, let them do it. But if you're thinking about self-publishing, get to talk to your manufacturer, your printer, and see if there's creative ways that they can do things to just add a little zhuzh to your parts. Now, just remember, everybody, that once you add any type of plastic to your cards, they are no longer recyclable. So that's a thing to consider if you are trying to be, environmentally friendly in a specific game. What else are we talking about? So, now that we have people here, because suddenly people are showing up with questions because of the YouTube link that I put up. Wonderful. If you have any questions for Chris Solis or Morgan Lair, we're talking about specifically, graphic design 101 type stuff today. And normally this does come up from a perspective of like card frame layout is a big one. So I'm gonna pass this to Chris first, and then Morgan can like jump on after that. But Chris, when you were designing, because a lot of the games that I've seen you have are fairly card heavy, right? Would you say you do a lot of card stuff?
Yeah, almost. My games are almost entirely cards.
Yeah. So do you focus a lot on you personally designing a card frame, or do you kind of like talk to the graphic designer, or what? How does that work for you?
I've done most of my card frames myself. When I'm prototyping, I'll think about the usability of it and the experience of it, of understanding the game. And my card frame will be like shapes and colors of the most basic. I wouldn't call it art in any way. It's just like this icon is red, this section is brown, right? Then at some point when I'm happy and I'm almost certain that won't change, I will try drawing it. Or if I think what it needs is beyond my skill set, then I will hire somebody. But it usually comes pretty late.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Interesting.
It's pretty just colors and bare bones for a while.
Okay.
I start with my card layout almost immediately. That's almost the first thing I do. But that's because I have I always follow the same general rules for all my cards. And I don't think my cards are anywhere near as complicated as your cards. From what you're saying, I've generally, except for this last game, the roller derby game, oh my God, it's just got way too many icons that need to fit. I don't know how to do it. So I'm just going to try first of all and reduce the number of icons.
Yeah.
See if I can do that. But yeah. So Morgan, what do you think about that? Like in terms of card layout design, how do you generally start things out?
I will say something that I will probably say a lot during this panel. Every game is different. Sometimes a client will come to us with a either pretty well done layout or a very simple layout. The less things that you need to represent on a card, the easier it's going to be to arrive at a strong layout for it. Clandestine, which is up there behind me where my thumb was, has secret cards that need to contain 9 pieces of information in addition to a fairly long effect. So figuring out how to get those pieces of information all on the card and in such a way where those pieces of information are in the same locations as other similar cards that use similar costs and similar effects definitely something that I would want to work with the client on before the client is married to a particular layout, because in all likelihood, with a card that complex, you have probably missed something. If you're not a professional, you've probably done something thinking about the way that particular pieces of information interact, or you've missed that such that it's not in the ideal place. So that's one of the things that I feel is really helpful for our firm in particular as information design specialists, is looking at those associations, building that concept bank, figuring out what we can do about making sure that that information comes in clearly across the entire set on the whole project. So you're not just designing the cards in a vacuum, you're designing the cards as well as the board, as well as the tokens, and making sure that all of that visual language is saying the same thing, so that when the user learns one thing, they can expand that learning onto other components that they look at.
That is a great way of putting it. I love that. You're considering the holistic game and not just the cards, because I find, and this is kind of with, we talked about Magic the Gathering already. Magic the Gathering being one of the biggest influences on modern game design. That a lot of people who are designing games, they may have their card frames, and by card frames, George, yeah, we are talking about the border plus the general regions where information is presented, which we'll talk about in a second, I guess. But a lot of people will kind of copy the Magic card frame concepts, modify it a little bit for their game, but then all the rest of the components of the game, if they're not just cards, don't talk to each other, don't share that visual language that you're talking about. So I think that's really important. Um, so George does bring up a good point here. General regions. I was looking at a card that somebody put up on, some design forum the other day, and it was just kind of stuff spewed on a card, right? It's just stuff on a card. And a lot of people, in giving feedback, were talking about how certain types of information should be in certain areas. Can you talk a little bit to that, Morgan, in terms of like hierarchy of
Yes,
information,
I was
how
waiting
we
for
how
hierarchy of
we
information.
how we physically hold cards and all that kind of stuff?
Okay, so let's define hierarchy. Hierarchy is a principle in graphic design that basically means in what order do you process what is being communicated. So, for instance, if I give you a coupon for a restaurant, the coupon for the restaurant probably wants to show you what is being offered. So that will either be the text for your offer or a picture of the item, then how much of a discount you get, and then the terms at the very bottom of the hierarchy. That's something that they don't really think is important for you to notice. So for a card game, or really for any component, there isn't really any difference in the way that I approach doing cards versus doing other components, because they all need to say stuff. But for cards in particular, the way that people tend to use cards is they'll hold them in their hand, and they will tend to fan them out with the bottom card on the left and then the top card on the right.
Depends
So
if they're right-handed or left-handed, though.
It does depend if they're right-handed or left-handed, but there have been so many games throughout history, from standard deck games up till games in the modern era, that lean on that top left corner. I've generally found that even left-handed people will tend to fan their cards from left to right, just because it's the way that card games are designed. And that's deeply useful if you are designing a game for people to use, because they will bring those preconceived notions into the thing that they're attempting to play. So, speaking of that top left corner, because that is the corner that is visible on all of your cards when you fan them out, that top left corner and the left side in general tends to be a very high value area for your visual hierarchy, and that's some place that you want to put the most important components on your card that you will want your player to be able to see at a glance. Magic is actually a really good example of this. A lot of games, when they're thinking about the iconography that they're putting on, they want to put all their iconography for like costs and things like that in the left-hand corner. And Magic doesn't do that. And a lot of people think that that's kind of weird. But it makes sense for Magic, because Magic has a bajillion different cards. And just knowing in your hand, like, this costs 2, when I have 8 different things that cost 2 in my deck, that doesn't actually give me any useful information. The thing that does give me the useful information is the name of the card, which is the thing that's in the upper left-hand corner, because that's the thing that I've likely memorized when building my deck. So if I'm looking at, like, say, a deck that has Lightning Bolt and a deck that has Raging Goblin, and both of those things cost 1, but they do very different things, that doesn't really tell me what I need to do. But if I see that light and I see that rag, those are the things that are going to tell me exactly what that card in my hand is.
Right.
So one of the questions that we had leading up to this was Kristen actually saying that she's been struggling a lot with her card layouts.
Mm-hmm.
And generally I don't struggle with my card layouts because, as I mentioned, I've got a standard. I've just sent Sen a copy of one of those cards. So this is one of the card layouts that I've done as a super draft to this.
Like how everybody
very
leans
first
in.
version of this card, because I thought
I'll
it would
make
be
it big.
hilarious.
Oh, thank you.
To actually look at this incredibly busy card to demonstrate how just ridiculously there's just too much on here. And I thought it was a really good example of a card that says way more than you possibly need, and a game that probably has too many steps in it. So if you have a look at it, the first thing up in that top left corner is it's telling you that this is a team card, so that this will apply to the team rather than the individual player. Then it's got 3 different symbols that work a little bit the way that the symbols in Daybreak work. These are the ones, when you stack the cards, they will unlock your abilities further down. The next thing on there is when you add this card to your tableau, you get symbol there +2. So you get 2 extra versions of that. After that, that no longer matters. Then there's a little bit of information about Derby. Then the next bit is, if you have these symbols, then if you discard another card, then you get some extras of this. So it's just like, obviously this is a very first version of the game. But I thought this was a really good way of saying, oh my God, there is way too much happening on this card. This could be quite a fun thing to talk about. So
just as a first pass, Kat,
yes,
the stuff in the white section is not game critical information, correct?
no, it's not. This is
Perfect.
where
Okay,
this
done.
is flavor.
Okay, have at
That's
it.
where there would be an
Have at
illustration.
it, people.
Okay, so Kat, you said a couple of things in describing this that I'm going to push back on. I don't think that any given layout in a vacuum is bad, and I don't think that looking at a card and seeing that it has a bunch of steps on it is necessarily an indicator that your game has too many steps. I think those are good things to be thinking about in general, but ultimately the mode of communication that you have with your user is going to be predicated upon what you're actually communicating to them. Some games are more complex and need to have more complex information that is delivered to the person who's trying to use it.
In the context of this game, the card is introducing more complexity than the game has.
Yeah, it's sometimes difficult to speak intelligently, at least for me, on how to provide feedback to a particular card if I don't know the project. That's why it's
that's why I'm using this one as an example of the game. The way that you actually play is you play a card, and on playing the card, you do a thing. Like you get a certain amount of values. Once the card is down, you can either use the ability that it has on the front, very much like Daybreak. So the exercise was for me to learn from Daybreak how to build that kind of card stacking thing. So I deliberately used that aspect of Daybreak. But also to make decisions about whether you decide to cover it up or not. And what you're doing is you're preparing for the bout. And if you discard this card during the bout, it can have other impacts as well. So some of these cards have during the bout impacts instead. So in this particular case, it's a prepping one. Horizontal layout's a good idea. This actually, yes, it does go on.
Perhaps.
It does go on the table once you've finished using it. Yeah, horizontal is a good way of getting that information separated.
So I think something that I'm noticing immediately is that there are a lot of arrows on this card, and the arrows all kind of mean different things. Yes. Usually if you are having a graphic element that you're trying to get to communicate a particular process, you want to be consistent in how you represent that process. So you've got like one thing where it says to add to your tableau up at the top. You've got one thing where the arrow seems to be representing discard this thing. You've got another arrow saying gain these resources, and then you've got another arrow saying that upon taking this action, then gain this other thing. So that's arrows doing 4 different things, which is not ideal.
Yeah, and for that purple bar, do you play, again, with the limited information in the game, do you play your card somewhere not your tab below?
No, this is the only time that you do anything with this is you either discard it or you add it to your tableau.
So that whole purple bar could be, if you use words, it could be like bolded word play and then +2 hand icons, and that's the same thing, because the only place I can ever play it is the tableau, so I don't need to see the 3 places it's going. And if you can get rid of the arrow, that helps this arrow problem. And maybe it's just like an inline icon of like a hand or a card, then +2.
Mhm.
And that saves like 1/8 of the card right there. And depending on how the game works, maybe that effect doesn't need to be in the center. Maybe it can be
it only happens once. It only happens on placement, and then you never need to know about it again. So it's probably in the wrong place on the card. Hierarchically, it's there in terms of this is the first thing that happens with this card, and so that's why I put it.
Is there an order of? Is there a top-down order of play to that?
Yes.
Yeah,
as
that
in,
makes sense.
when this lands, this happens. Then after that, once you've achieved those things, so if there are 2 chess pieces and weights in that pile, then every time you discard a card, you get extra team powers.
Oh, that's what that means.
Yeah.
Oh.
I actually stole the discard part, that last bit there. I stole that directly from Daybreak because I was like, how do I express this? And they've actually got the card crossed out and an arrow and then what you get. And I was like, cool, I'm just going to steal that idea.
So that card that thing at the bottom says, when this card is removed from play, do this. No,
upon discarding any other card from your hand.
If this is in
if this is your
in
top
the tableau,
card, you can discard another card in order to get an extra thing. So that is stolen directly from Daybreak. Like that concept is directly from there, because I thought, how do I make this work?
This then is an activated ability. So this is a choice that your player can make. Okay. Is there any relationship between the 2 pink colored sections?
Yes.
So the top bit and the second from the bottom.
They use the same icons, right?
The top section is the icons on this particular card. Has everyone played Daybreak?
No.
Has anyone played Daybreak? Oh, okay, that's our problem. All right, so in Daybreak,
possibly our problem, but also I do have to say that I really appreciate games. If I can, that when I look at the card layout, I know how to play the game.
Yeah, and that's not at all what's happening with this card.
Not at all.
So in Daybreak, what you're doing is you're stacking cards. Like, okay, there's a whole lot more, but in this particular bit, you're stacking cards, and the icons at the top of those cards, once you've got a certain number of those particular icons, so say you've got 3 A's, then the active thing on the top card that requires 3 A's can now
do that. Okay, got it. That makes sense. I get it.
But the 3 A's that you've got in the pile are not necessarily the ones that you use in order to activate it.
So an idea you could do is for the top, this card gives you those icons. Instead of that reading from left to right, what if you hung those from top to bottom, kind of like a banner?
Mm-hmm.
So then I know it's separate from all other instances of icon, which say spend or do something with it.
Oh, neat. Yeah, that's
like
a good idea.
I have these icons. I can use these icons. So that's something you could possibly play with.
And I could stack them differently.
Yeah.
How many different icons are there that you're counting, Kat?
So this is the game where I was talking about I've got like hundreds of different icons and it's all chaos, but I actually don't need as many. Right. So I actually only need 3 icons that work towards the 3 different powers that you can have depending on your specialty. So jammer, blocker, and pivot.
Basically the classes of
those there are abilities that relate to those 3, and then there are 5 different collectible icons, which are the ones that you use to trigger powers in the stack. Okay. But there were 9 of those types of those other ones, and I was like, it's too much to remember. So
part of the utility of us making a concept bank when we're looking at starting to develop the iconography is figuring out which concepts have similar functions or are used together. In Clandestine, which is behind me, we've got a couple of different classes of thing. So, for instance, resources that are typically represented as little coins on the table that you gain and then spend, those are all contained in a little circle. So it's a little circle with a symbol in it. So you know it's a resource and how that behaves because it's in a circle, and then you know what specific kind of resource that it's in because it's got the icon inside it. Then you've got different relic suits. Relics are contained in a hexagon, and then there's some other symbol inside that hexagon. You can not necessarily use shape for that. You could use like color. Color is a good container. You can use texture for a container. You can use size for a container. But it's the same kind of container thing that I was talking about earlier, where external context that then zooms in on an internal context can tell you a lot of things very compactly about what that thing is trying to do. So in this, for instance, since you've got like 3 general superclasses of thing, those can all be icons with some sort of similarity between them. And then you've got 5 different subclasses of thing. Those icons can also have some kind of similarity between them that helps indicate, even if you don't know what particularly that icon does, you can recognize that class and go, okay, this is going to have similar behavior to this other icon that I already know.
So that actually works towards George's question there a little bit, where he's saying, does everything need to be absorbed in the first couple of turns, or is there tolerance for a first game being a learning experience? Chris, what's been your experience with that, with your card games?
So I will say, first of all, my games are lighter and not like Euro-y, so there might be a difference here. But I want to make sure that by the end of the first game, they truly understand all the rules. For games of my weight, again, they're like half-hour games, right? They might feel like the game is a tutorial game, but if they play again, they should be done learning. That's something I set for games of that weight for myself. Again, it really, really depends, right?
How would you describe the weight of your games for people who don't know your games?
Yeah, they're like usually 30-minute head-to-head games. Probably no more complex than like Seven Wonders the Duel or like Radlands, that kind of stuff.
Cool.
And that doesn't mean you might not have a question about a card, but you should know all the rules and be able to like play, right?
And so I suppose what you're saying is it depends on the weight of the game, how many times you should need to play it in order to be able to access that. Because I think, again, what George is saying there is what you find as an acceptable learning curve for that, depending on the complexity of the game. I would say that for light games, you should get it by the end of the first play, maybe the second play, depending. But once the weight starts to go up, I think it's acceptable for it to take longer to understand.
I remember playing a game of
how to parse it.
I played a game called Guards of Atlantis, and it was like a chunky 2.5-hour like MOBA kind of game. And I would say I understood it by the end of the first game like 90%. There's probably still a few things I need to learn, but it was enough for me to feel like, yeah, next time we play, we can go. I don't have to relearn it, even though that might be like a soft lie I tell myself. And I don't know, that to me is in the acceptable range. If I feel confused, I'm just less likely to play it again, and I don't want that from my products.
Yeah, I think you struck on a really good chord there, Chris. My goal in all the games I make, and I make some pretty complex games, is that none of the audience for that game, because different games have different audiences, end up feeling unintelligent by the end of it. They should feel like they were clever enough to get it, or that it didn't need any getting whatsoever, if that's the audience that we're aiming for. So I would push back a little bit and say, a light game isn't something that you should figure out by the end of it. It should be intuitive to play a light game. Like a very approachable, very, very consumer friendly game should be approachable from the get-go. And that would have to do with number of icons, how straightforward those icons are. Like sometimes you see these icons on some of these space games that have like 90 billion icons, and you're like, that's just art. That's not an icon that tells me exactly what that's about. It's not like
a
Starship
language with
engine.
too many letters.
Yeah. And that letter has no like meaning. And I do a lot of work in language, in psychology, so it's like that's just a phoneme. That doesn't mean anything to anybody. It's just a sound, and that's like you're saying, Morgan. That's just an image, has no meaning to it. It's a letter with no. It doesn't have a form to it, right? Those are good questions. Let's see here. Kristen is saying still that she struggles with where to place different things on cards. She's feeling like she needs to establish a personal standard, like Kat does, of where cost goes here, effect goes here, anything additional goes here. And she asks in the follow-up question, is there a typical standard of where those things go on a card, cost, effect, points in prototyping as well as finished games? And I think, Morgan, you were talking about how Magic does it, but do you have any hints for poor Christian here?
The short answer is no. There isn't a single standard for where particular things go on cards in general, because every game has different requirements for what it wants to represent first. Especially for cards, since you're typically fanning them out, that top left corner is going to be probably your most valuable space, and you want the thing there that you want the user to know first when accessing your card. Sometimes that is cost, but
What's the
like I
most
said in
important
Magic's
thing?
case,
Yeah.
sometimes it's going to be the name, or sometimes it's going to be the number of victory points. In Clandestine, for instance, I have the costs of all the cards on the bottom left corner. And the reason that I have them on the bottom left corner is because all of these cards tuck underneath your tableau. And those costs are relevant for another effect that counts up the number of symbols in that costs and uses it for something else. So even though in your hand, that's the most valuable space, and you do want to know about costs for things, it's not the most important thing that you would want to know. So
I mean, there are lots of variables with like how the card is used, when you're going. So is the first thing you do you pay a cost on it? Is that the first thing you need to think about with this card? Or is there an effect of it that is the first thing you need to think about with the game? And that's one of the ways of figuring it out. Like what are you doing with this card first? So in the case of mine, for example, the first thing I'm doing is potentially placing this in my tableau. So that's the first thing that I've got in the order of things, apart from that top row, which gets tucked. So the reason that's in that top row is because you're basically stacking and showing just that bit sticking out the top.
So yeah, so for this card in this game that you're doing, Kat, correct me if I'm wrong, but you take cards that all look like this, and then the next play might be laying another card over this card where you're just keeping that top little pink row exposed. And now the top card is a different card than Derby wise. It'll be like, I don't know, like block or something.
Yes.
But it'll have different icons, maybe the same, maybe different. It might not be a team card, I don't know, but it'll have a different effect. And now I can use the icons from the card beneath it, plus the icons on this particular card that's on top to do an effect, perhaps.
Yes.
Okay, cool. So that's why the top bar is exposed.
Yes.
And that you were saying that purple, the darker purple bar underneath it, that Chris was saying, doesn't need to have that large picture there, is just that's a on placement effect that you're going to get once when you play that card, and it's the first thing that's really getting covered up. But it's all the whole rest of the card's getting covered up too. Okay. So I get how those are used, and that is so that's why those cards are like that. Is a team card versus a non-team card important? Because that little icon is taking up like the prime real estate.
So it is important because the outcome of this goes towards either the shared benefits or your personal benefits, which matter for when you're actually in the bout. Because you're basically you're getting your team to a particular level. You can see what the other team is going to look like, but you don't know what the other players are going to be like. So the first thing you need to do is make sure that your team is good enough to beat their team. And then you're trying to improve your own player stats after that.
Yeah. So Kristen, I would say, based on what we're learning today and what Morgan's saying and experiences that Chris and Kat have had, that instead of dividing it up and saying cost goes here and effect goes here, it'd be most important thing goes here, least important thing may go over here, wherever that might be. And there's actually, if you divide it up, Eric Lang, when he designs cards, he talks about this diagonal line that kind of crosses from the if you take a card and go like 3/4 of the way over on the top and put a little dot there, and then go like 5/6 of the way down the left side of the card and put a dot there and draw a diagonal line, everything to the left of that is prime real estate, and everything to the right of that is like not you're not going to see it in a game where you fan your cards, right? In a game
Correct.
where you hold cards in hand. And so I don't know if you've ever played Magic, Kristen, but a lot of Magic players do the Magic Shuffle where it's card on top of card on top of card because they're reading the whole darn thing until they really know the card and then they can fan them. And this is why whenever I'm trying to give advice on card layout, I ask them, how do you use these cards? Do you hold them in your hand? Do you put them in a tableau? Do you splay them? Do you tuck them? Because usage is actually quintessential to understand what the most important piece of information is. Your card could look very pretty, but it could also be completely useless depending on the intended use of that card and how it interacts with other pieces in the game. Like if this is Magic and there's supposed to be tokens on your I hate token creatures, by the way. Don't ever play with them. But if you do play with tokens, they got to have a place to go. And that's why token cards were invented, because tokens became very annoying, right? So anyways, I think there's a lot there. Troy is saying, and by the way, I didn't know, Morgan, that you worked on the Beetle game that they made.
Yeah, Pins and Beetles.
And
Yeah, Troy and I worked together on that.
That is, I think, like the graphic design and the layout on that game is like chef's kiss. Well done.
Thank you.
Like everything was so clear. Troy sent that to me and I was playing it. It's like, I get how to play this. Like, remember I said I like games where I get how to play it just by looking at it? That is a game where, and it's not a simple game. It's that it's well communicated. The intention of all the pieces is well communicated. And there's a lot of bits in there. Like there's cards and there's tokens and there's a board and there's stuff. So it's not a simple game. It's not a super complex game, but it communicates its intent very well.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
That was a very fun project to work on.
And the art is beautiful too. So not that you're the artist, but
Yeah,
the art is lovely. I love insects. So Troy says we don't use diagonal fan enough. We could get an L-shaped viewable area. Then again, I have huge hands. What's an L? What's a diagonal
huge
fan?
hands? Yeah,
so I have tiny hands. So that could be a thing where we don't get that. And there is, with board games anyways, you have the luxury perhaps of including things like a holder for your cards, or a way to put your cards that aren't in play on a player board if public information is not, or private information is not a premium. So there's other things you can do in board games that you can't do in pure card games that are, card in hand versus card on table.
Like kind of a card Scrabble holder for those who don't know.
Yeah. That's exactly what I'm talking about. Card Scrabble holder. Perfect.
I mean, it's the best way I could think of to describe it.
You're
If you
not
haven't
wrong,
seen
Kat,
them, you
you're
don't
not wrong.
like, what?
Yeah. So just we're coming up on the hour, and we did start a little late, so we have a couple more minutes. But if there's any questions from out in there in Maple Syrup Land, please feel free to ask. Kat, do you have any more questions for the guests?
I think my biggest ones have been covered, and having a horrible example to talk about was quite useful. I think, like, there's too much on this card, there's some stuff we need to change. It's been really useful to see the different ideas that people had with that. I think the most important thing that I could take away from this is that there is no standard thing that you can apply to all your games. I think you can apply them to your personal style. So, Chris, if all of your games follow the same card format, then you could do that because that's what you do. So there's no rule that you can't do that. I'm not sure if that's the case or not, but at the same time, like forcing yourself to do that because this is the Chris style of card that's not what we're saying. Would that work for you, Chris?
It's the Chris style because it's like readable to me and the people I play test. Like even no matter how much I try to share it, at the end of the day, I still have a range, right? So to me, it feels intuitive, but it might not be to someone else, and I understand that. Play test your games, focus test them, and see what really works. I do start with a template and change it based on the game.
This card here is an example of my standard template, Kristen. This is what I always start with. It's got basically a heading. In this case, I moved the subheading to the top because it represents an icon that will eventually be there. But it's a heading, an illustration, what happens, and the extra bonus potential element to it. So that's it. That's I happen to illustrate them while I'm thinking about them. You do not need to do this. That's part of my process, but I just basically leave a space for an illustration, and I have what it is, what it's grouped in. So this is a wardrobe card. This particular one is pink brogues. And when you trade in this card, you'll get +3 battery life, and it is part 2 out of the 4 parts of a fuse if you use it that way.
Oh, I see. That's what the bottom is showing.
Yeah, it's not a good icon. I've improved it since, but this is just that's the functionality of this card. Like what it's worth if you get rid of it, what it is now, and what it is in the collection, which is Pink Brogue. So it's one of the wardrobe cards.
Cool.
So I'd like to come back to the comment that I made at the start of the show about graphic design being designing tools. Each different game is a different tool that you're trying to use to express your entertainment to the person who's using it. And the trouble with thinking about this as like, this is my standard and I'm going to try and stick to my standard is like, if I have had a really excellent career designing screwdrivers, and then I decide, okay, now I'm going to design a hammer. This is still like something that I use my hands with, but like a hammer, I need to grip it this way. The force is going this way. I need to think about that versus a screwdriver where the force is torsion, and I need to think about that. So the handle of these two things is going to be very different, even though both of these things are used by a hand. So for those of you out there who are thinking about your own projects and how to consider graphic design when looking at them, think about principles and not about processes. So the principle that you're using to decide which pieces of information are related, how you order information around your card, versus this is where things tend to go, so that's where I'm going to put them. Or this is the software that I'm familiar with, so that's the way that I'm going to do this. Figuring out what you're going to do so far as the needs of the game is way more important than figuring out how you're actually going to like put it on a card.
Yeah. And it's all, like you said, Morgan, context specific, right? So
Absolutely.
which game it is, how how pieces interact together, which is why I really, one of my biggest things early on was a lot of people like, oh yeah, I design games. Oh, can we play them? No, they're in my head. It's like, well, then you don't really actually have a game, right? Because I can't interact with the pieces, and I really can't give you feedback because I don't know how these things interact, right? Because games are like this. They're not like this. They're like pieces merging together all the time.
And we just demonstrated that with an example card. Like everyone going, yeah, but what is it? What does it do? How can I tell you if this works if I don't know what it does? That's exactly the thing, right? You can't give feedback on a game design until you play it because it's a game for playing.
Which is why it's always super important when we onboard clients to play the game.
Yeah.
It's very difficult to figure out what is best for your layout unless your game is incredibly simple before we actually play it. Especially if I'm doing your rulebook. If I'm doing your rulebook, I really need to have played your game in order to make sure that I understand the processes.
Good point. All right. Well, I think we're gonna call it a day. We have we answered a lot of questions, a lot of good people in the chat talking to us. So if you want to talk to me more, you can find me on Twitter and Blue Sky at Senfeng Lim.
Thank you, Troy.
Yes, right. Or design the game and hire Morgan to make your design accessible. That's right.
I am available for such labor.
Yeah, we'll get to Troy's. Sorry, not Troy. We'll get to Morgan's contact information in a second. Kat, where are you?
Dreyer Inc. on all the things.
Dreyer Inc. on all the things, and we are both at Meeple Syrup on all the things, even the things that I do not understand.
Like Instagram. Oh no, it's so new and challenging.
I hate Instagram. Jovialgraphics.com. Whose website is that?
That's mine.
Hey. And if people want to reach you personally, they can find you at morgan@jovialgraphics.com.
That's correct.
So if you're looking to hire a graphic designer, the other thing that you can do if you're not even hiring somebody, you can consult with them, right? Maybe, I don't know if Morgan has consultation hours, fees, whatever,
I absolutely do.
but you can book him for like an hour of his time to go over stuff that you, especially as a prototype design, right?
Yeah,
The
early
prototype
stages.
still needs to be usable, but it maybe
Can't
doesn't
recommend it
need
enough.
maybe it doesn't need the full Morgan treatment, right? Yet. But if you can, spend buy an hour or two of time, that might be enough to kickstart your own design to a place where it's actually usable and playable and getting the feedback that you really need, as opposed to the feedback like, why is that icon there? Or what is that icon? Because that is not actually that helpful for the game working. Chris, where are you at? You're at Solis Game Studios.
Yeah, check out my games.
There you go.
Yeah.
And Chris, you said that your games are they mostly 2-player games, or are they mostly like PvP head to head, or
They're
I've looked
usually
at
head
them.
to head, but the player
Yeah.
count's pretty variable. Made a game called Pocket Paragon. It's like a 5-minute dueling game. And then we have like
Yeah.
Space Line. It's like a free for all. And
I
now
did actually want to ask you something about that, Chris, because I've heard a lot of people use head to head when they only ever mean 2-player, but it can be head to head with more than 2-player, can't it?
not Pocket Paragons, but Space Line can. So it is that kind of game, but it's more of a battle royale. That's kind of like the twist with that one.
Yeah,
Right.
like PvPvP or PvE or whatever. There's different ways of saying things, but
I think
we get
what
what you
people
mean.
really mean is that this is a dueling game.
Yeah, this is
It's like-
antagonistic. You're going to poke
Right,
each
yeah.
other in the face with cards. There you go. And Chris, people, if they want to reach you, it's at Chris
Yeah,
at
that's-
solisgames.com.
Yeah, happy to answer any questions, and we can have a chat.
There you go. Troy is like,
Yeah.
you could give my contact information too, because I made a mistake there. Thank you. That's helpful, says Kristen. And George says, thanks all. Great conversation. If you want to help keep the lights on here, you can reach us at patreon.com/maple-syrup. And hey, Morgan and Chris, can we get a piece of final advice from you? We'll start with Morgan. Morgan, what's your piece of final advice in terms of maybe game design, graphic design, whatever you want? Don't eat yellow snow. I don't know.
Oh, let's see. I have all kinds of pearls of wisdom that I like to leave with people, and I know that sounds incredibly pretentious, but it's fun to like think about yourself as an authority. When you're
your cat
about,
does not think you're an authority.
The cat's
That's
like,
hilarious,
oh
just
my
a
god.
he's a jerk like all cats. So
right.
When you're thinking about how to make your game, think about who it's for and what they expect out of it. When you're thinking about graphic design in particular, there are all kinds of different ways that you can make entertainment, but the person who has played your game probably wasn't born yesterday and is playing games for the very first time. They've probably played another game. They've probably played another game like your game. So how can you build on the existing principles that other people have had success with to make your game even better? Like I have kept saying throughout this conversation, you're building a tool. If you're building a hammer, you're probably not going to come up with some incredibly original way of making a hammer that still feels good to use. You should think about how other people have used the tools at their disposal to create the same results that you're trying to achieve. Analyze what they have done to make those results good, and use what they have learned to give you learning in order to push yourself into that direction.
Excellent. And Chris, what about you?
Yeah, so the board game industry has a range of creators, from indie to the top. And I'm sure maybe a lot of people watching this are going to make their own game and whatnot. There's a lot of best practices to consider. They're all important. We talked about them here today. But I also think it's really important that like you think about the humanity of what you're doing and keep it in your game. Don't like sand it out. It's important that you made it and people understand why you think it's awesome so that it can feel awesome to them when they play it. Yeah, can you make it personal?
What do you mean by standing out the humanity?
Like if, like, let's say you have a game and you're like, hey, I want to follow all these best practices. All these best practices are exactly true, factually, whatever, right? At the end of the day, is your game interesting? I'll give you an example, actually. Right? I had my battle royale game, right? And I took out the player elimination. because
Oh,
on
because
paper that's
Yeah.
bad, right? But it turns out when people buy a battle royale board game, being eliminated is something they expected, and I got criticized for taking it out.
yeah, no, I
Right?
get that.
And that was like part of the original vision of it. So, what I wanted to make was in conflict with the best practice. And I should have understood that that's something I should make an exception for, because that's why this is its own game.
Well, I mean, Morgan, you mentioned it already. Like, what do players of those types of games expect, right?
Right.
Mhm.
And players of what battle royale or anything where there's PvP type stuff expect to be eliminated at some point,
Yeah.
or at least have eliminations be meaningful. One of my favorite games of last year was the robot game that I'm gonna forget the name of from Wise Wizards, and they did a really good job of doing like death of a robot, but the robot just comes right back. But it's still meaningful in how you score the game, and it was really well done for like a family level robot game. My name is I gotta get the name.
I've blanked on it too. I need to look up what it's called.
It's great. And the graphic design's really easy, really good. Robot Quest. Sorry, there you go.
Yeah, it's
sorry,
really good.
Yeah.
sorry, everybody at Wise Wizard who are my good friends. My fault. And it was
There are
literally one of my
no-
favorite games.
There are no bad mechanics. There are no inherently bad mechanics. There are only inappropriate mechanics.
Yeah.
Everything
That's
that
great.
you do that you can design has a place. It's just, is this the right place for you to use it? And sometimes those best practices are not appropriate. Sometimes the worst practices are appropriate.
Yeah, and best practice doesn't mean it's always right.
Yeah. It's
It means
best
that
practice, not perfect practice.
Yeah, and it's situationally correct, right? And there's going to be these contexts like we were talking about through this whole show where it doesn't make any sense. And sometimes games that break those conventions actually shine because they basically subvert your expectations, right? Or sometimes they go with them and they push heavy into that expectation, which is cool. Yeah, Robot Quest, Troy, you're right. Cool. Go play it. It's a good game. Anyway, next week, Kat will not be here because she has a movie to go to. That's okay. You can go to the movies.
Yeah.
It's allowed.
You know when you book something and you're sure that you've got all of the things set up correctly, and you check the date and you check the movie and you're like, yep, definitely got that all lined up correctly, and you click it and then it goes, haha, you've booked for a different date and a different movie and this is non-refundable, and you're like,
No.
Oh, was it actually
Oh,
a
no.
different movie?
oh yeah.
Oh my
Yeah,
gosh.
yeah. This is a drive-in. They do a different movie every night of
Oh.
Okay.
the month for October. You drive in, they have people in costumes that all like come up
Yeah,
and
it's
yell
like
at
it's
you and
actually
do
super
crazy
special.
things, and they
It's
show
not
different
just going to the
movies.
movies. It's going
And
to an event.
we were trying to book for Halloween, and we got
Uh,
the 9th of October, and we're like, what
That's like-
happened?
22
But-
days different. That's like
So
not
what are you
even.
Yeah,
watching?
that's
Yeah.
fine.
So what are you
Yeah,
gonna
what-
go
what
see?
you get?
Oh, we've got Halloween as well. We've booked Halloween.
Oh, okay.
As
But
well.
what are you what are you
Until
watching?
Halloween.
But we're going to see Cabin in the Woods.
Oh,
Wow.
right.
That's a great movie.
Cabin in the Woods. Cabin in the
So good.
Woods is brilliant, actually. It's
I
a
know,
great
really
movie.
Scary. I don't want to see an actually scary one where people are jumping at the windows. I
It's
want
great.
to see one that's not scary. But now I'm going to an actually scary one.
Oh yeah, it's definitely. a
They
better
they
movie.
come up to the window and it's dark, right? And they're like, bah! And you're like, ah! So yeah,
I would need to bring like an extra change of underwear. I'm pretty sure. All right, so leaving on that lovely note about my underwear. Next week we have no Cat, but we do have one singular Andrew Lowen from Crowdfunding Nerds, who's going to come on to talk about crowdfunding and how to really like generate the numbers that you need to have a successful start. Because as my friends from Kickstarter say, Kickstarter can start the fire if you bring the fuel, which is the people. So you have to do a lot of lead generation, and Andrew is a person who's really good at that. So we'll bring him on. We can ask him questions next week about how do we get a lot of people interested day one, because day one funding is so critical. And I don't mean just like funding to completion. I just mean any amount of funding on day one is a real litmus test of and a really strong indicator of how successful your campaign is going to be.
Yes.
So we'll look at the stats, we'll look at the numbers, and we'll ask a whole bunch of questions. So if you're interested in crowdfunding in any way, shape, or form, come back next week and we'll talk with Andrew Lowen from Crowdfunding Nerds. All right, that's it for today. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Troy, Kristen. Who else was here? George was here, of course.
Deadpan was here.
Yeah, Deadpan. Everybody was here. And of course, thanks to our guests, Morgan and Chris.
Thank you very much for having me.
Anytime. Bye.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye.